Let's roll. Authorized cornerstone the resolution analysis of subpoint A is a resolution. The ICC should open an official investigation of Israel's actions into the Palestinian territories. The B is going to be that all Palestinian benefits as the best criteria for this round, as allows equal access and the most predictable burdens and methods of refutation. Authorization 2 is going to be the background one. There has been several back and forth firing of different types of military equipment and bombings and airstrikes going back and forth between the Gaza Strip and Israel, killing thousands of people and creating a constant conflict. Additionally, this does not just start today. It has been going on for years and years and years, where this has been, there have been ceasefires, but then they restart. And additionally, several ceasefires in the past spurring bombings were broken within a few days, which means that there is always a propensity for Israel to continue to strike. Going on, plain text. The International Criminal Court will open an official investigation of Israel's actions into in the Palestinian territory. Okay. All right.
It's the res.
Yeah. Advantage wants to be checking Israel. It is going to be the uniqueness. The first argument here is that Israel is aggressive now and has had a precedent of being aggressive. The little A is that between July 8th and August 21st, there were 2,100 deaths in Gaza due to bombs that were fired over the walls and over the borders. The little B here is that 7 and 10 of these were 7 and 10 of the deaths in Palestine were civilians, and they were the ones who were being targeted specifically. The little C here was that it was largely Israel that was instigating. You can see that over 70% of the deaths were in the Palestinian territories, where the latter were in Israeli territories, meaning that they were taking the brunt of the force. The little C here is that they have the propensity to bomb in the future. They just got a hold of a firebomb, and there has been talk about them being able to use this, which means that a break of the ceasefire.
Yeah,
what's the exact word?
There was an instance of someone in the Palestinian territory launching a firebomb into Israel, which Israel used as justification.
Okay. Yeah, there was an instance in Palestine where they launched a firebomb into Israel, which gives Israel justification, and they have continued to try to justify their attacks on the Gaza Strip for the entirety of this. The second meaning argument is that the U.S. has said that they will pull support if Israel is indicted. The little A is that there was a bill introduced into Congress that tried to set this in motion, saying that once there's an indictment that happens, they will... No.
Scratch that, that's not true.
Okay,
It's the other way.
Okay.
Just trust me.
Scratch that. The second argument here is that the U.S. will pull support from Israel if they are indicted because of the fact that they will look perceptually bad. If Israel is convicted of human rights, the U.S. is going to be on the wrong side if they continue to back them. Which means that there is no reason why they would continue to do this, and they are extremely key to Israel. Going on to the solvency. The first is that there will be an ICC investigation into the area. The second argument here is that this is a perception of trouble, and just the idea that they are going to be investigated will force Israel to back off. If they know that they are looking closely, it means that they have no ability to do this, and their veil of justifications will be falling short, which means that there's no reason to do. The little A here is that the U.S. is their #1 supplier of arms in Israel, which is a huge reason why they would never risk losing U.S. support entirely. The little B here is that using U.S. funding in support of the Iron Dome is always going to be key, because if Hamas does get more of a power, Israel fears that they will be able to attack them without the Iron Dome, which means that the maintenance of the Iron Dome is always going to be a reason why they would never go against us. The impacts. The first is going to be deaths. There were thousands of deaths within a span of months, and there have been a lot more than that in the span of history with the attacks going back and forth, which means that being able to check Israel will stop this. Additionally, with Israel being the instigator, it is very unlikely that Hamas or anyone in the Palestinian territories will strike first, meaning that there will not be future conflicts down the road. So you're always going to be looking to the fact that you can save thousands of lives through the lack of bombs in the future. Going on to advantage 2. You can call this disposability. A is going to be the uniqueness. The first argument here is that the Palestinians' perspective has been silenced in the issue. The little A is that you can look to the mass media. There were several instances where high-level officials of the Israeli administration were coming on to mainstream media talking about their justification. There was their president and prime ministers and foreign aid people that were coming up and saying that they have this huge justification, and having several interviews that were basically streaming live on major networks showing that it was totally okay. But the little B here is that Hamas had absolutely no media coverage whatsoever. They had no ability to respond to this, and no way to counter this, and there was absolutely no Palestinian voice in the media showing that they were just entirely silence. The second argument here is that you can cross-apply that the statistics show that Israel was the instigator. There were 73% of the times where Israel was the first strike, and that was the reason why Palestinian territories had back. And then there was only 8% of the time where they were where the Palestinian territories attacked first, and they would then strike back. But that was ended extremely quickly, which means that Israel has actually been the one starting this, even though the media would perceive us to believe that Palestinians are the ones to start this. The third argument here is the demonization of Islam as in entirety. When people point at the bottom, yeah, flex.
Is it flex this time? This half? No, it is. It's pulled up. I don't know.
I read it. Yeah, it's what that.
Okay. Anyways, the third argument here is the demonization of Islam. When Hamas never got a voice in this, people said that they are just radicals who are trying to enforce their own views and continue out this basically the same stuff, the same types of things that Al Qaeda and the Taliban are doing, which is just extremely untrue, and it led to mass spread of these ideas and the rise of or Islamophobia within the U.S. The solvency is that one, the ICC investigates in this. The second is that they have to interview both sides, which will lead to media coverage of Hamas and Palestinian viewpoints as well. The third argument is that this spotlights the entirety of the scenario and allows for the Palestinian side of the conflict to get out as well. So the impact here is one, we fix the rhetoric of disposability that is happening without their voice. They have just been continuing to get bombed, which hasn't allowed us to see this. This violence has been largely invisible, leading to an entirely disposable population. When we allow for this disposability of populations, all that does is create the logic of genocide, because we don't care about their deaths and we just allow for the senseless killing until the entire culture is killed off. Additionally, an impact within the U.S. is that U.S. people try to have attacked other Islam people because of what is going on in the Middle East, and we can check this back with checking back Islamophobia.
Okay, time to flex?
Yep.
Okay, so, when did the United States say they would pull funding from Israel? Was it once the investigation started, or was it after they got indicted?
If Israel is indicted, they will pull funding. So just the perception of having a threat in the region will stop them, because they can't afford to lose U.S. funding.
Okay. So you say that the conflict is invisible, but who is it invisible to? Because we clearly are aware of the atrocities happening in Palestine.
Okay, it's not the conflict that is invisible. It is the Palestinian perspective, which has not been portrayed.
So the fact that over 1,000 people are dying and that their homes are being invaded by Israel, we're not aware that's happening as individuals in this room.
Well, no, but okay, that's not the argument. Israel has been able to justify what they are doing.
So at the state level, it's invisible, but individually, it's not.
No, not even that. But if you think about these conflicts, yes, you see the numbers, the statistics, but the individual's perspective, the perspective of a Palestinian individual who's been going through those conflicts has not been brought forward. That's their point.
One off on this?
Is it home?
Yeah. Ready? Alright, started. Debate has become a space where you normalize the power and influence of the state or any kind of governmental institution, in this case the ICC. This is for two reasons: indoctrination and situational crisis. And indoctrination means that we believe that the courts are effective, and that's something that we continually believe because of our education system. We believe that courts are somehow effective, accessible, and fair, but they operate through money. They're not actually as accessible and fair that we believe them to be. Next is situational crisis. Debate displaces our ability to understand the system itself as a crisis by positioning the resolution as a crisis itself. We never question the ICC because of the way debate is structured too. Role-playing the ICC causes us to be politically alienated for multiple reasons. The first is political powerlessness. We only feel powerful in the 45 minutes when we role-play. Outside of the debate space, we are overwhelmed by our powerlessness and feel like we can't actually change the world because we don't have the resources, and we operate under this illusion that we must rely on the ICC to solve any kind of crisis, and we just assume that the courts are just and functional. Next is guilt absolution. Role-playing leads to a lack of guilt because we blame wrong actions of the ICC or any kind of government institution on that institution. We benefit from the courts when we have money, and it votes in our favor even unjustly. Next is toleration of oppressive powers. Role-playing makes us tolerate powers of oppression. We tolerate the powers of oppression that Israel or any kind of governmental organization or the ICC has, and that toleration is eventually going to lead us succumbing to the oppressive ideologies. And it also leads to political complacency, where we are complacent with any kind of government action or any kind of action by the ICC. 3, we need to understand that the system is broken. The ICC selects cases at one seat. The Office of Prosecution is widely, largely Western based, and they're always going to support any kind of Western influence, and they're going to wish to match the United States' wish to colonize other nations and have political influence over other nations. The investigations are all on individuals that are not Western officials. The United States has never been investigated. Any kind of Western nation has never ever been investigated because Western nations have so much influence over the ICC. And only individuals that oppose any kind of Western power are investigated. 4, any kind of moderate reform is going to prevent any radical restructure of the social political system. There are 2 ways to reform a system radically and moderately. Moderate reform happens in the system itself. Radically reform happens outside the system, is able to actually change the system. Debate teaches us to look for any kind of moderate reform, but the problem with moderate reform is it's always going to be manipulated by the system in order to benefit individuals in power. 5 is infinite management strategies. And infinite management strategies when individuals in power look to individuals that can support them with money and actually work with those individuals in order to get across the political maneuvers and create the ideal political terrain for those political maneuvers. So what's happening is any kind of verdict by the ICC is going to bring forward Western ideas and allow the United States and other nations to continue enacting their political policy. So Israel is always going to win, and even in the world of the affirmative, the ICC is going to work with the United States federal government's values in order to do what the United States federal government wants. Thinks. 1, the identification of the resolution as a problem, the affirmative position of systems as otherwise functioning. We believe that the United States federal government, or the ICC, is completely functional because of the way the resolution and debate is structured. We are not able to actually identify the cause of any kind of their impacts. Their impacts are never going to be resolved but actually replicated. Even if they could solve their impacts in any kind of way, they're going to be replicated in another instance because they're using moderate reform to change the system. Any kind of moderate reform isn't going to be able to change it. Also, the United States is required to cut off funding to Palestine.
If the case goes to the ICC, they have to
if their case goes to
Palestine.
Okay. If their case,
if the case goes to
the United States would be required to cut off funding to Palestine, which would have alternate implications. They don't pay any attention to these implications and how that's actually going to harm the Palestinian individuals. They're using arguments of justification, and they don't.
So the court would use the arguments in the case to rule that Palestine is not a state.
Okay, Palestine is not a state. It's not recognized as a state by the United States government. The ICC doesn't recognize it as a state and would use that to manipulate the result. And then the next argument, so also they say that the Palestinian voice is invisible, but the Palestinian voice isn't actually invisible to individuals besides the government. An example of this is over the summer, the rubble bucket challenge. Individuals in Palestine actually dumped rubble on their heads instead of water, like the ice bucket challenge in the United States, to show how individuals ignore the Palestinian voice. These videos went viral and were extremely popular, and people on the internet saw them because they were so popular. They were such radical videos. Okay, also there's a prediction for disruptions. Any kind of political disruption is going to be predicted by individuals in power, and we're going to have a premeditated response to that. They're using the logic of the state in order to the logic of the state and the state system in order to keep those individuals in power, and they're advancing that system of power. In fact, when political alienation results in complacency with the ICC's action and any kind of government after action, it makes us develop an identity disconnect. We criticize the ICC and the government and Western ontology and benefit from the atrocious results of that ontology. All of their impacts are going to be replicated because they are benefiting from that instance of ontology, or that Western ontology too. Feeling politically powerless causes us to only fix social issues while we're role-playing because we feel like we can't solve outside of the debate space. We're not going to take action outside of the debate space. They're not going to go solve or do their act outside of the debate space in any way. We're going to stop pushing actions of the ICC and other kind of actions after the ground because we don't have any resources that the ICC has or the United States government has. The affirmative impacts are going to happen in the future outside of the ground, and we're not going to stop them from happening. We're not going to care. We're going to benefit from those actions when they happen outside of the ground. Role-playing as the United States, role-playing as the ICC prevents us from actually interrogating our own actions, so we don't consider how our own actions actually affect the events in Palestine and how we are inextricably linked to the events in Palestine and how we are individually politically responsible to those to Palestine because of the United States federal government and because our link to Israel. Also, this creates a disposable population because if we are complacent with that government action, that complacency is going to lead to social death. So this is caused by the impact there. The alternative is to reject the political bureaucracy, the affirmative, and place the radical reimagination of the plan as a democratic demand. Reject the political bureaucracy of the affirmative in place of a radical reimagination of the plan as a democratic demand.
Text then status?
Unconditional. 1. The alternative is a project of radical reimagination. What this means is that we're envisioning the affirmative without reliance on the ICC. An example of this would be if individuals in Israel themselves actually stopped committing the atrocities against Palestinian individuals, and if that kind of border war actually stopped, if you have some kind of individual understanding of why your ontology is wrong and you work to change that ontology, is actually going to stop. Otherwise, all of that impacts are just going to be replicated in other parts of the world and replicated elsewhere. Because of the affirmative, we are able to cultivate a democratic culture. 2. The rejection of role plays, the ICC makes us take personal responsibility. We realize that we are individually connected to the situation in Israel and Palestine, and we're going to take individual responsibility to actually solve that issue and not just pretend to solve it in the debate space and then ignore it later. 3. Challenges to the clarity of all alternative are just based on the idea that political bureaucracies are going to attempt to overdetermine what our alternative is. Any kind of social reorientation is going to start with a question, and a questioning of the system. Any kind of political bureaucracy or anyone in political power, even the affirmative team, is going to say that we only question and don't take any actual action, therefore our movement is going to fail. However, questioning is only the first step. We need to move on from that step and look to political indignance to try to get our point across. Fourth is indignance. We're going to use indignance to solve the affirmative. Okay, on case. Look to their uniqueness. They say I'm going to use 1. Individuals who stop. Okay.
Just say that Israel will be able to buy the courts.
Israel is going to be able to buy the courts with the United States.
Do you want to say they have resources?
They have the resources to buy the courts, and they have United States support. The United States isn't going to let Israel be indicted. The United States has often human rights as well. Also, the ICC investigation, is they going to make Israel back off if they say insolvency? You're on their impact, but it's not going to make Israel back off. They're going to continue doing what they do. Also, death is happening now. They're attacked us an hour.
Starting flux. Okay, so I have a few questions. First, how does debate as like a simulation of policy, like why should we as individuals feel guilty about having a thought experiment?
It's not necessarily that we should feel guilty about a thought experiment. It's that we don't feel guilty for atrocities that happen. So like,
so I'm supposed to feel personally guilty.
Yes, you are, because you allow those atrocities to continue. That's entirely.
I personally allow the atrocity in Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, because we don't take any action outside of this room.
How could I personally, outside of this room,
be involved? Join a group, join an anti-Israel.
How do you know that I'm not in groups like that?
I'm just saying debate as a whole leads to this inaction.
Okay.
That's our argument.
But if the U.S. federal government hasn't been able to stop Israel from striking, then how are we as individuals supposed to stop it?
Okay, but that's what the entirety of alternative is based on.
Is that
You're individuals that only the United States can solve.
Okay, can I get one more thing? What does that say?
Democratic demand.
Democratic demand.
Yes,
Thank
kind
you.
of.
No, I got you. I didn't need to do that. Thank you.
Yep.
I will start the case today, which is going to go advantage 1 and then advantage 2, and then it's going to be the critique straight after. It will be the alternative on top.
Oh, all on top?
Yeah.
Of the critique.
Right.
But after the case.
I will make sure it's not because I know you for sure. Everybody good? Good. All of the negative argumentation functions on links of omission. However, we are going to win argumentation why we are right, why this is our individual advocacy. Our affirmative plan is the mechanism through which we are calling on change to happen in the world. That we are individuals actors, not only in this round, but also outside of the grounds and indication why we will be able to. We will not only be internally turning all of the affirmative case, additionally, how we are rejecting the entirety of the power charges that they discuss. Eventually. The only argument that they make here is that the United States is not going to allow for Israel to be indicted. However, they say we do not without need for Israel to be indicted. All the argumentation we are giving you at the PMC is about how just the perception that Israel is being investigated, just the investigation necessary to be able to break down this harm, to be able to break down this harm, to check Israel. Additionally, this function is internally turned to the particular argumentation about the way that the United States and the way that it's written that Israel have worked to maintain their power structure and to oppress the Palestinian people's indication why that is allowing for that harm to continue. This is our call to action. This is my name. Grace's call for change to occur within the world. Now we say that this would be the result. That's our argumentation that you should be. You as a judge, you should be rejecting these forms of violence and reject the deaths and then rejects that are happening. And I said that you should be endorsing this mechanism, not for a theoretic perspective, but rather that we are able to break down this harm and this harm within the world. Measure 2 on disposability.
They said that Israel's not going to back off.
They additionally say that Israel is not going to back off, primarily from the fact that not only has the United States been a major proponent, which is an indication of why the United States were to change their perspective and have to be able to save face from the world, is an indication of why they would prevent this, they change their opposition, and in fact there will be things like international pressures, an indication of why this would resolve this. The only argument they make is that death is happening now. However, this is exactly our argumentation that there is violence that's happening against the Palestinian people, and that their Palestinian perspective has been silenced as a result of the way that political and social elites change the narrative. The way to think that we only allow for Israeli officials to be a part of the case. They're the only ones that are the voices allowed to come up with an indication of how that violence is occurring. This is our attempt to open up that perspective, to allow for individuals to have that narrative, to break down that understanding. Reject this argumentation. This is exactly what you can extend. This is why you can extend the argumentation we are giving you, that the opening up the space, the opening up the investigation line for those narratives to come up is a way that you can break down those systems, functions internally, turn to the criticism. We are rejecting this form of science. We are rejecting this way that the way that social elites constructs this understanding means that we are able to spotlight this issue through our individual activism, through our voice, our speech actions, the way that we are able to break down this understanding, be able to change the world in the way that we believe that should be happening. On the critique, starting with the alternative. First argument is going to be the permutation, reject the polybureaucracy in place of a radical reimagination as a democratic command. It's permutate the planet on allowing new to exclusive parts beyond. Permutation solves the first argument is that we can have an individual action while working outside the system, that we can have a multiplicity of approaches, and that the affirmative is our mechanism through which we are able to break down this current understanding. This is our call outside the political system in order to be able to make the changes that we deal with it. And additionally, the argument is on the other hand. Additionally, the second argument is that this allows for the multiplicity of approaches, the multiplicity of ideas. That most social movements function only approach through singular actions. You can literally occupy Wall Street as an example of that. They try to come to only work without the system, outside the system, try to utilize things like sit-ins in order to be able to create their social change. However, they refuse to do only engage in the political system will cause them to be tokenized, and indication of how we would not have to take a multiplicity of approaches in order to be able to break down the systems of oppression that are happening with not only on a state level, additionally in our individual life, additionally on the alternative itself. The first argument is no solvency, the rejection fails. You can look at that, you look at the fact that you can look to Occupy Wall Street as an example of how just relentlessly rejecting the system is unable to create the real change, because it really allows for the social elites to utilize things like the media to be able to bring the appeal to the ethics of the masses that they are not able to create any real change. Additionally, the second argument is disadvantage the alternative that I've seen the political, that they take their approach completely outside of the political sphere to the point which we are in they are engaged. They're to engage with those political elites. How the political elites the ones that have all the guns and have all the money and are control the way that the world perceives these individual situations. It means that this has a couple of implications. First, comes no solvency to the alternative. This means that there would be none there, that no one's going to talk about, no one's going to realize that the democratic demand is happening outside of this understanding. The second argument is that this leads to further violence as political elites try to isolate and destroy these individuals who try to take this approach as an indication why this would lead to only further violence. Additionally, the third argument is that this is a permanent that benefits the permutation. This means that we can work within the system in order to be able to break down the harms that are happening, and be able to take multiplicity of approaches, able to break down this work from worse action. Good.
On their solvency, they say rejection of role play is key, but since debate isn't a role play, your rejection doesn't get you anywhere.
They say on the alternative solvency that rejection of role playing is key. However, we are not taking the role playing approach to that. Rather, we are trying to break down that idea that this is our speech, that we are individual actions, that our permanent plans, our call to action to create change. Okay, I'm starting at the top of the critique now. First argument is that this is our advocacy, this is our speech. Every word that we say has implications not only within the realm, but additionally that has implications within the world. It means when we read our stuff, you can see this is our call to the ICC to make the change, to be able to break that. This understanding means we are better be able to break out that system. Additionally, the second argument is that we are not the ICC. We never claim to be the ICC. This is our form of activism. The third argument is that all of the links that they are talking about are all links of omission. For example, they say that we don't solve for the harms of Palestine because we don't talk about how the funding implications happen. These are all just links of omission, the way they try to interact with these argumentation. Additionally, the fourth argument is turn that we able to break, turn that our call breakdown for the SEC to take this investigation breaks down the United States control of other countries. Look at the fact that the way that the United States maintains control is through their proxies and through engagement with controls the Palestinian state through only strikes, but additionally through things like monetary controls. An indication why when you can listen to our call for action on event one, you can look at the fact that this would be a breaking down of this form of imperialist control. Additionally, the measures when we turn to reject the SEC, that the idea that the SEC will have in fact the entire thesis of the PMC is that the SEC is not actually an effective actor, rather it just needs to be a open place of investigation the way that we can have a place where spaces can be open in order to aid the trace that is happening. But additionally, the next argument is turn to their spotlight, the issue of Palestine. They make argumentation about how the Palestinian conflict is already They make arguments about how the Palestinian conflict is visible, and that they bring up the warrant how like individuals in Palestine were dropping rocks on their head. It's exactly the problem we're talking about. That the Palestinian narrative not only doesn't come out because people are only watching it to see people drop rocks on their heads, but additionally, this is exactly the form of sexual pornography that they talk about. That is pervasive within the current mindset they talk about. The indication why this approach and why we have to break down this approach to be able to actually have a space for change to happen. The next set of arguments is going to be the state is inevitable, and is inevitable. The first argument is that the state has all the money, has all the guns, indication why they're individual protection, not for be able to protect the Additionally, the second argument is that the state has nuclear weapons. This is an indication why a social movement that's trying to break that is not going to resolve this.
Oh, I have a minute. Okay, roadmap's going to be the framework and the links, then the alt, impacts, case and model. Remember that? Becomes a pretty easy battle for the negative team when they can see two link turns that turns the entirety of the affirmative team on the link page, and they can see that those turns can resolve the 100% of the affirmative case, which means there's only a risk that they cause all their impacts to happen, and we resolve those impacts and resolve for political alienation in the world of critique. Let's go to the framework. The first argument is that our advocacy works because we're implicated in the world. Well, I want to present Madeline's arguments that when you advocate for the state, it's actually bad because it makes you believe that you use it to political and use it to political become politically alien and don't comply with the state. We have three reasons for this. You only interact with our solution of guilt argument once you sin. Now the fact that you don't think you have enough resources to act out of the state, which means never do, and also the toleration of powers, which means you succumb to the ideology of the state, which means that even if you somehow don't feel guilty for the but that somehow don't feel guilty in the world of role-playing, you still never act because you don't feel like you can do anything. This is really proven by the process from the questions they have. And so since the United States has all these bad things and has these military troops, how can we ever do something to resolve the issues? I don't know, but how about Israeli individuals in the region stop going to war, stop bombing these individuals in Palestine here? That's a really good way of individuals to resolve an issue. Our argument is through collective action. We can do whatever we want to. We don't have the United States federal government or any state organization resolve these issues. We can as individuals ICC, which you feel happens, the United States instantaneously cuts off the budget. That is the argument Madeline makes. Do not look at PMR and expound how this is not true. This is game over. All their impacts was disposable populations, and death happened because without funding from the United States, people have no access to food, no access to water, no access to anything that is necessary, which is an indication that your impact's way worse. Also, I want to extend the fact that Palestine will never be viewed as a legitimate state in the result of the plan because we are winning arguments that Israel's going to Israel's not going to back down. That as a result of a court case that Palestine will never be viewed as a recognized state because of the justifications. Go to the alt page. Group together all the permutation and benefit arguments. We think we have to win that the permutation is going to be because you cost the United States got funding law from Palestine, but we're responsible for many of the first arguments and disability. We see that it is good to not act in statements the losses can remain invisible, makes it so that the state cannot overdetermine our movement and not tell the cost of the sale. Also allow for irreversibility. We say for our movement to eventually work, we have to be able to not only dismantle states but get rid of our need for the state. You don't allow for us to happen because we need the ICC to cause the court case to come to pass. The next argument is you. This is the form of model reformation. I want to extend our framework argument to how model reformation is inevitably fail because they get us voted by the state, which implication that the interpretation will never work. Next argument I want you to this argument is an actual overdetermination where you turn to label what our movement is all their arguments on how we're occupy Wall Street. This is our third argument talking about how you town singularity, but this is really bad because it makes it so our movement never works. And also we're not similar to occupy Wall Street or whatsoever. It's just up the state to make sure that we have a predetermination of the movement. Or that's why we're specifically about why our argument is specifically bad. You only articulate the word time is similar to the WS military, so that's why that's true. The next argument is we don't have to stop. We don't. The next argument is we are solving for political alienation within this room because we allow for us individuals to be aware that individuals can resolve this because we don't have to put it on the federal government. This is first. So all the people talk about how we allow for the radical reimagination by having Israel individuals get out of Palestine and not be part of the military, not bomb these nations out of battle. It takes a long ass time to explain exactly how this works in the LOC, which is an indication that you don't need the affirmative plan text. We don't need the ICC, which means that any risk of offense, you are always voting for the negative. The next argument we say is term proceeding to political. We say this is non-unique, the proceeding to political right now. Now we resolve this through the alternative. The next argument is if you can't solve the impacts, which means that it's a net benefit to the current. I don't really understand how we can solve for the I don't really understand. We solve for 100% of the policy of the impacts because we understand that we have to take political responsibility for the atrocities happening right now in the status quo. Next argument you say is we are not role-playing. I don't understand you're not role-playing when you have to plan text through the ICC. That's literally the definition of what role-playing is. And then additionally we articulate that don't look at me down and a bunch of analysis about how they allow look, if they really wanted to critique the ICC and not role-play the ICC, they could have been non-topical. They could have dismantled the ICC, done something that said that this is going to show how illegitimate this is. Or we articulate that just role-playing in itself is bad because it allows us to tolerate the ideologies of the same. Next one I want to say is our second talking point is an indication that all the arguments that help us solve for the political responsibilities is ludicrous because we start recognizing that we're just responsible for not taking action when we are aware that violent things are happening in Palestine right now. What are the impacts? First, we're back on Jason or complacency impact. This is an articulation that we have an identity disconnect when we allow for virtual society happening in Palestine and we blame things like the ICC for why it happens. We don't feel political responsible for taking those actions. This argument that we're responsible for all the impacts on the affirmative page, for all the impacts on the affirmative page, but more importantly, we start articulating in the future when I say when Emlet starts invading Palestine again, that we're not going to take action to resolve this because we don't
the order is going to be links, impacts, all case. Ready? Reason you're voting negative in today's speech is because they all solve the entirety of the case, especially because they conceded 2 link turns, which is the overview Caitlin gave. Okay, so go to the links page right now. We solve the entirety of the alternative, and we also solve the entirety of their case. So they link directly in the case, and they're going to cause Palestine to not have any funding. They're replicating their impacts. They're replicating all the negative impacts that the Palestinian people face right now by cutting all of their funding. They don't respond to this argument. It's really also really important. The other important link on this page that they did respond to is the Palestinian voice being invisible. They completely mischaracterized this argument. What I said was the Palestinian voice is actually visible to individual people. You have to take that kind of individual responsibility in order to solve the actual problem. What happened is that individuals in Palestine would actually pour rubble from the damage, from bombings from Israel on their heads in order to show how individuals in the United States, individuals over the West who ice bucket challenge were being ridiculous because they had water and they were wasting water, which they didn't have in Palestine. So their individual voice is there, it's just that individuals don't recognize that voice, and they're going to perpetuate that impact. They're perpetuating our impacts. That seems related to all of our impacts that they're going to be able to continue. They can't solve any of our impacts even with a permutation. They're actually causing all of their impacts. Okay, next argument is on the impacts. Okay, most important impact here that I'm going to extend as the second impact. You're never going to be able to solve this outside of the debate because political alienation is going to cause every single impact. The alternative isn't going alternative solves for political alienation, but they can never solve for any kind of political alienation because they don't try to solve for any of their impacts outside of the debate space. They feel like they can't solve them outside of the debate space because they don't adequately respond to our argument about political alienation. Disposable population, their impact is still going to happen outside of the debate space once this 45 minutes is over, and they can no longer role play and no longer pretend that they think that they can tell the ICC what to do. Okay, go to the alt. The most important thing about the alternative is right now, because they can't solve their own case and replicate their own impacts, they have to go to the permutation. You can't not let them go to the permutation in the PMR. But what this is going to happen is that Caitlin puts tons of arguments on the permutation. She puts like 6 or 7 arguments on the permutation. They're not going to be able to solve it, so they're not going to be able to win today's debate because they're not going to be able to win the permutation. They have to answer it. You can't not let them answer it in the PMR. What?
So just talk about how the permutation is still still makes it so we don't feel politically responsible, at least in this instance.
Okay, so the permutation is still going to perpetuate the idea that we have to rely on some actor like the ICC or some big place to solve our problems. The permutation doesn't work because we don't take any political individual responsibility for the issues going on and for the events in Palestine right now. The reason the alternative is able to solve and the reason that the alternative is able to solve their case is because with the alternative, individuals are going to have some kind of individual understanding that what they're doing to Palestine is wrong, and Israelis are going to be able to stop doing that. They're going to take impetus to stop the atrocious actions in Palestine that are all their impacts, and those impacts aren't going to be replicated. That is what the alternative solves, and why we went to this debate.
Explain exactly how the alternative does that. Say it's like an
okay, essentially what the alternative does is it's a radical reimagination. So what is going to happen is individuals are going to imagine solving the problem outside of the debate. They might come up here and say that imagination doesn't solve anything, but their case doesn't solve anything either. They can't actually make the ICC do anything. So our radical reimagination is just as valid as their case.
So you say it's like how we fiat, we are imagining this happens.
Imagination is equivalent to fiat. Okay. Okay.
Sorry, point forward. The argument that imagination is the same thing as fiat is new in the speech.
We think that we're just explaining how the alternative functions, and we made those arguments in the LC. Additionally, I made the argument that what it is us imagining collective action, and we're just explaining that that imagination is just what radical imagination means.
Okay, under consideration.
Okay. All right. So on case, what is important about their case is their summons is completely reliant on the ICC. Extend all Caitlin's argument saying that any kind of indictment isn't going to matter. They say that indictment, it doesn't matter, but indictment isn't going to do anything unless Israel is indicted. None of their solvency happens. Solvency doesn't happen because Israel is indicted, and Israel is going to be able to continue treating Palestine the way it is because Israel is going to lose its standing on human rights.
Also, it doesn't feel indicted either. It doesn't fear that it's going to lose.
It doesn't fear that it's going to lose because it has the support of the United States federal government, which is a Western power, which is controls the ICC. Any kind of Western power, any kind of Western influence is going to have control over the ICC.
Are you trying to stop?
Yeah. Yeah.
Alright, start flips now.
So what do you believe is the best mechanism for social activism?
Individual action.
How? Like what should we do?
Like, for example, if I wanted to stop student loans, and like make student loans not so big a problem, I would pay off other people's student loans. Or if I didn't want coal mining to be a big issue, I would go fight a university so they would stop funding coal mines. These are what protesters around the world are doing now. They are literally acting outside of the state by doing things more radical than most people would imagine, but it's the only way these things are effective without being exploited.
But our Speech Act isn't credible in your eyes as individual action.
No,
Because you're not
doing
doing
it.
it.
It's
You're
all
acting.
But isn't that an assumption about what we do in like all of our lives?
No, you should not. It's saying that because all of
We're
our
like do engage in civil engagement.
We're just saying overall this is what vape does. This is the type of psychological effect it has.
So links of omission, right? Okay.
Not links of omission. You didn't respond to our arguments.
Alright. It's going to be an overview, advantage 2, then the alt page, I know the K, so I'll just signpost for you. It's going to be the alt links framework. Or sorry, the alt framework links impacts and then advantage 1. Actually, move advantage 1 to the front.
So advantage 1, advantage 2, the alternative, then the rest of the K down?
Yeah.
Cool.
When there is absolutely zero offense on case and no framework to why the critique comes first, there is no way that they are going to be outweighing. Additionally, zero arguments about why the perm doesn't function is going to be a crystal clear ballot for the affirmative. Going on to advantage 1, they only extend one argument through the block that says that they will buy out the court systems, but first of all, these are not where the solvency comes from. It comes from the perception of investigation. The investigation itself is what is going to create the idea that Israel is being looked into and that they are in trouble, which means that they are not going to risk the U.S. pulling their funding. You can refer the warrants that we are giving you because we are telling you that we are like single-handedly supplying your iron dome, which is going to be uniquely key in these conflicts, which is a huge reason why they would never do this. They never answer this back. The only arguments they are giving you are taglines and don't have warrants under them, which means that you are always going to be referring to several warrants coming out of the PMC about why Israel would never risk the U.S. ever pulling support. This is strictly a perception advantage, not on the indictment, on the investigation. It was clear from the beginning. We get full impacts to the disposability populations, which equals the logic of genocide, which is going to have the highest magnitude in this round, as well as the most probability when they read zero arguments against our links. And it is a straight link turn to the critique. They do not answer these arguments. Going on to advantage 2, they cold concede this out of the block. You can extend the entirety of this advantage, saying that we have the ability to change the perspective, change our perspective, which means that this is an internal link turn to the K because we change the mind of the state. We no longer allow the state to control the narrative, and when we don't allow them to control the narrative, then this is a way to break it down. They never answer this back. That this is literally the breakdown of the system that they are calling for and individual action that they want to see, which means that this is always going to be turning back their critique. They don't answer any of this in the block. It's game over right there. Going on to the alternative. On the permutation, they do not say this. There's absolutely no reason why we can't reimagine but also do the plan. They don't read any arguments here. They don't read any warranted arguments here about why the permutation doesn't work. You're going to be referring to the fact of the Wall Street warranting here when we extend this out and tell you that the multiplicity of the approach is the only way to actually deal with this and to actually do anything. This is a completely non-competitive critique, and there is absolutely no reason why the permutation doesn't function. You can see that we can have action and call to make changes. Additionally, the biggest argument that you're going to be extending through here is that this plain text is our individual call to action for the ICC. When they do not respond to this, they were rejecting our voices in this debate, saying that that is not adequate enough. If what they want is individual voices, what Corey and I are giving you is our individual voice. Their rejection of this as adequate is exactly why the critique doesn't function. We are trying to speak and they are saying that that is not good enough. So what is and what will create solvency? They never give you these answers, which means that their critique has absolutely zero solvency on this argument. Additionally, they don't extend through any of their solvency points or explain how reimagine actually does anything. They don't read any framework about how fiat is allowed through the alternative. They don't give you any reasons why they can use fiat to reimagine and actually solve things, which means that you're not going to be granting them an ounce of solvency here because the reimagination is not going to have the ability to do this. You can any argument about how our alternative doesn't result in action, like kind of fiat. We make analysis specifically that this would result for individuals in Palestine, like in Israel, leaving Palestine in the LOC.
state. So those arguments should be responded in the MG.
This is a specific argument that when they say in the LOR that they get to fiat the reimagination, which is how they start granting solvency. It's a response to that.
And the MG makes the argument that rejection fails. We use Occupy Wall Street as an example of how just rejecting through the system doesn't translate to action. It may be a little bit different in the wording, but
It's the
we
same
make
argument.
it.